I need to start from the beginning because, honestly, what happened this week has been building for 3 years and I'm still processing how spectacularly this all blew up in their faces. But let me give you the context first because otherwise none of this makes so sense. My family has always been obsessed with status. Like, really obsessed. We grew up in Westfield Heights, which, if you don't know, is one of those suburbs where everyone drives a luxury SUV and the neighborhood Facebook group loses their minds if someone's lawn isn't perfectly manicured. Dad's an orthopedic surgeon. Mom sells luxury real estate. My brother Derek is a corporate lawyer at some big firm downtown. And my sister Vanessa married a cardiothoracic surgeon. They all live in the same zip code, attend the same country club, and spend every gathering comparing whose kid got into what Ivy League school or whose vacation to the Maldives was more Instagrammable. Then there's me, Marcus, 26 years old, assistant manager at Foot Locker in the Riverside Mall. I know how that sounds. Trust me, I know. But here's what they don't tell people at their fancy dinner parties. I've been working retail since I was 19 because I actually like it. I like helping people find shoes that fit right. I like managing inventory. I like building a team and hitting sales targets. After 2 years of community college, where I was miserable studying business because Dad insisted, I dropped out and just started working full-time. Moved into a small apartment across town, stopped going to family dinners every Sunday, and basically became the family secret. When people asked about me, Mom would say I was taking time to figure things out. Then it became I was exploring different career paths. By the time I hit 25, I straight up didn't exist in their conversations anymore. My cousin Andrea told me last year that she'd heard Mom tell someone at a charity gala that she had 2 children. 2. Like I just evaporated. But I need to back up to 3 years ago because that's when everything really changed. And that's what makes what happened this week so incredibly satisfying. 3 years ago, my grandfather died, Dad's father. Grandpa Jim was the only person in that family who ever treated me like I wasn't defective for not wanting to be a doctor or lawyer. He owned a construction company, built it from nothing. And he used to tell me that honest work was honest work whether you wore a suit or a name tag. When he died, he left behind a trust. Substantial one. Split 3 ways between me, Derek, and Vanessa. But here's the thing that made Mom almost faint when the lawyer read the will. Grandpa made me the trustee. Not Dad. Not Derek, the golden child lawyer. Me, the retail worker. The family embarrassment. The trust was set up weird. Each of us had a designated amount, but it wasn't just sitting there for us to grab. Grandpa structured it so the money released at specific life milestones or legitimate needs. Derek got his portion for a down payment on his house 2 years ago. Vanessa got hers for her wedding last year. Both times they needed my signature as trustee to release the funds. Both times they were furious that they had to ask me, the Foot Locker guy, for permission to access their own inheritance. But they asked. Oh, they asked real nice. Derek showed up at my apartment with Thai food and this forced smile, talking about how family sticks together. Vanessa actually cried, said she'd always loved me and didn't understand why we'd grown apart. I signed both times because despite everything, they were still my siblings, and Grandpa's will was clear about the conditions. They got their money, I got an awkward thank you text, and then I went back to not existing. What they don't know, what Mom and Dad especially don't know, is that Grandpa's trust included provisions for them too. See, Dad borrowed against his future inheritance 3 years ago for some investment that went bad. Mom took an advance for a real estate deal that fell through. The trust allows for that, but every penny has to be paid back before they can access anything else. And guess who has full visibility into all of that? As trustee. The family failure working at Foot Locker. I know exactly how much money they owe back to the trust. I know exactly how tight their finances are despite the luxury cars and country club memberships. And I know that without accessing the rest of that trust, they're basically living an expensive lie that's one emergency away from collapsing. So when Vanessa called me 2 Tuesdays ago, I was in the middle of inventory. We'd just gotten a massive shipment of the new running shoe line, and I was checking boxes against the manifest when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer because Tuesday afternoons are always busy, but I saw her name and figured maybe someone died or something actually important happened. She didn't even say hello, just launched right into it. She told me not to come to Mom's 60th birthday party that Saturday. Said I would embarrass everyone. When I asked what she meant, she actually laughed. Not a funny laugh, a mean one. She said I was 26 years old working at Foot Locker like a teenage dropout, while everyone else had real jobs. She said Mom's friends' kids were surgeons and lawyers and executives. And what was I? A retail worker who smelled like shoe rubber. I told her I was assistant manager. that I supervised 8 people, handled scheduling, managed a 6-figure monthly inventory, and was on track for a store manager position next year. She screamed into the phone. I had to pull it away from my ear. She said assistant manager meant nothing, that I measured feet for minimum wage, that I was a disgrace to the family name. She said everyone would ask about me, and what were they supposed to say? That their brother sold sneakers to teenagers at the mall? I hung up, stood there in the stockroom surrounded by Nike boxes and Adidas shipments, and I just felt cold, not sad, not hurt, just cold and calculating. Because this wasn't new. This was just the first time someone said it directly to my face instead of behind my back. An hour later, Mom called. Her voice had that fake sweet tone she uses when she wants something but is pretending to be concerned. She said Vanessa told her we'd talked. She said she understood I might feel left out, but maybe it was better if I didn't come Saturday. When I asked why, she dropped the sweet act. She told me that Karen's son just made partner at 30, that Linda's daughter was a surgeon, that Stephanie's kid was doing something impressive with tech in San Francisco. Then she said, and I will never forget this exact wording, she said I sell sneakers to teenagers, and it's humiliating for her to have to explain that to her friends. She said people ask about me and she doesn't know what to say anymore, without lying. I asked what she's been saying. She got quiet. Then she admitted, she's been telling people I'm traveling for business. I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. Traveling for business. Selling running shoes at the Riverside Mall was now international business travel in her fantasy world. She got defensive, said she was protecting the family reputation, said I'd made my choices and now I had to live with the consequences. Then she suggested maybe I could think about going back to school, getting a real career, making something of myself so she wouldn't have to lie anymore. Like my entire existence was just an inconvenience she had to manage at her social gathering. I hung up on her too. Finished my shift, went home to my apartment and ordered pizza. Sat there eating pepperoni slices and thinking about how I'd spent 3 years being erased from their lives while still holding the keys to their financial stability. The irony wasn't lost on me. Wednesday morning, I got a text from Dad. Didn't even bother calling. Just a text that said I should do them all a favor and stay home Saturday. Said nobody wanted to explain why their son was a retail slave at 26 when everyone else's kids were successful. Retail slave. My own father. Derek messaged me on Facebook that afternoon. We weren't even friends on Facebook anymore, but apparently he'd unblocked me just for this. Said Mom told everyone I was traveling for business and I better not ruin her lie. Called me a loser. Laughed about the whole thing. Added that maybe if I'd actually tried in school instead of giving up like a quitter, I wouldn't be in this position. Thursday, my cousin Andrea posted something on Instagram. I don't follow her, but my buddy Kyle from work does, and he showed me. She'd posted a photo of her outfit for a party coming up, and in the caption mentioned being thankful the family disappointment wouldn't be there to ruin the vibe. Didn't name me specifically, but everyone knew who she meant. Friday, I worked a double shift. Helped a kid find his first pair of basketball shoes. The way his face lit up when he tried them on and did a few test jumps reminded me why I actually liked this job. His mom thanked me like 3 times for being patient and helping them find something in their budget. I went home that night and thought about how these people were strangers, and they treated me with more respect than my own family. Saturday was Mom's party. I wasn't invited, obviously, but I knew it was happening. Big catered event at their house in Westfield Heights. Mom had been planning it for months back when I was still occasionally included in family group texts before Vanessa removed me. It was supposed to be elegant, sophisticated, impressive. All her friends and their successful children celebrating her milestone birthday. I didn't plan to go anywhere near it. Spent the day working, came home, changed into sweats, ordered Chinese food, was planning to play video games and ignore the whole thing. But around 8 p.m., I got this weird urge to just drive past. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to see what I was missing. Maybe I was torturing myself. Maybe I just needed to see it with my own eyes that I really had been completely erased. So I drove to Westfield Heights, parked down the street from their house. There must have been 100 people there. Cars lined both sides of the street, catering vans, string lights in the backyard. I could hear music and laughter from inside my car. Could see people in expensive clothes through the windows, holding wine glasses, socializing. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, just watching. Then I saw Mom through the bay window. She was standing in the living room and people had gathered around her. Someone handed her a microphone. Even from outside, I could hear her speech through the open windows. She talked about how blessed she was, how proud she was of her children. Derek, the successful lawyer. Vanessa, who married so well. How they'd both accomplished so much and made her proud every single day. She actually got emotional. People clapped. Someone wiped tears. It was a beautiful moment celebrating her wonderful family. I didn't exist, not even a mention, not even a passing reference. Just Derek and Vanessa, her two children. The successful ones. The ones worth mentioning. I drove home. Didn't feel sad or hurt this time either, just that same cold calculation. Because something had shifted. This wasn't just about being excluded from a party, this was about being completely erased, while they all benefited from Grandpa's trust that I controlled. This was about them thinking I was too worthless to exist in their stories, while simultaneously depending on me for their financial security. Sunday morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the law firm that managed Grandpa's trust. I had some questions about my responsibilities as trustee and what circumstances would require additional approvals for fund releases. The second was to an old friend from community college who'd become an accountant. Asked him some hypothetical questions about trust management and fiduciary responsibilities. The third call was to my district manager at work, asking about insurance coverage in our benefits package. Specifically, what kind of legal consultation was included. Sunday afternoon, my phone stayed silent. Nobody called to apologize or explain. Nobody sent a message saying they'd missed me at the party. It was like the party happened in an alternate universe where I'd never existed at all. I spent the rest of Sunday organizing some paperwork, going through files from the trust, looking at timelines and requirements and stipulations Grandpa had built in, understanding exactly what leverage I had and how the system worked, being thorough, being methodical, being patient. Because if there's one thing retail management teaches you, it's inventory control. You need to know exactly what you have, where it is, and what it's worth before you make any moves. Monday morning, I woke up at 4:30 a.m. to my door practically coming off its hinges. Someone was pounding on it, not knocking, pounding. I could hear multiple voices in the hallway, shouting, my name being called. More pounding. I looked through the peephole and saw exactly what I'd been waiting 3 years for. Dad, Mom, Derek, and Vanessa. All 4 of them. At 5 in the morning. At my apartment that they'd never visited before. That they'd never asked the address for. That didn't exist in their world until exactly this moment. They needed me, the retail slave, the family embarrassment, the one they'd erased from their stories. They needed me so desperately they were destroying my door at 5 a.m. I checked my phone. 15 missed calls from Derek starting at 11 p.m. Sunday. 8 from Dad. 23 text messages I hadn't heard because I'd put my phone on silent. Voicemails. Increasingly frantic messages about needing to talk urgently, about a family emergency, about how important it was that I call back immediately. I stood there in my apartment, in the same pajama pants and old Foot Locker t-shirt I'd worn to bed, listening to my family lose their minds outside my door, and I smiled. Because I knew exactly what they wanted. And for the first time in 3 years, I had all the power. But I didn't open the door yet. I just stood there, listening to them panic, and thought about what Grandpa used to say about people who confuse worth with status. Then, I made myself some coffee. Let them knock a while longer. After all, I had nothing but time. And they clearly had some kind of emergency that only I could solve. Funny how that works. Update 1. Okay, so I got so many messages after my last post, asking what happened when I finally opened the door. Some of you guessed pretty close to what the emergency was, and shout out to the person who said, let them sweat. I definitely did that. But the actual conversation was even more insane than I expected, and what came out during that confrontation opened up like 3 more cans of worms I didn't even know existed. So there I was, 5 in the morning, coffee brewing, listening to my family absolutely lose it outside my apartment door. The pounding hadn't stopped. Mom was calling my name in that voice she used to use when I was a kid and had done something wrong. Derek was yelling about how this was serious and I needed to open up right now. Dad kept saying we had a situation that required immediate attention. Vanessa was just screaming that I was being childish and ridiculous. I took my time, poured my coffee, added cream, stirred it slowly. Let them knock for another 5 minutes while I stood in my kitchen in my Foot Locker pajama pants and just existed in the moment. Because this moment right here, this was 3 years of preparation paying off. Every time they'd made me feel worthless, every time they'd excluded me, every time they'd pretended I didn't exist, it was all building to them standing outside my door at 5 a.m., desperate for my help. Finally, I walked over and opened it. Didn't say anything. Just stood there holding my coffee and looked at all 4 of them. They were still in clothes from the night before. Mom's makeup was smudged like she'd been crying. Dad looked exhausted. Derek had his shirt untucked and his hair was a mess. Vanessa was in her party dress and heels and she looked furious. They all started talking at once. Mom pushed past me into my apartment without being invited. Dad followed. Derek and Vanessa came in last, and Derek closed the door behind them like they were about to have some kind of intervention. None of them asked if they could come in. None of them apologized for the 5 a.m. wake-up. They just invaded my space like they had every right to be there. Mom looked around my apartment and I could see her processing everything. The modest furniture from IKEA, my small TV, the Foot Locker polo hanging on the back of a chair. This was the first time any of them had ever been here, and I could see her judgment written all over her face. But she was trying to control it because she needed something from me. Dad cut straight to it. He said they had a serious problem and I needed to sign papers immediately. Derek pulled out his phone and started pulling up documents. Vanessa was pacing in my small living room, looking at everything like it was contaminated. I sipped my coffee and asked what kind of problem. Nobody answered right away. They all looked at each other like they were trying to figure out who should explain. Finally, Mom sat down on my couch uninvited and told me that they needed to access additional funds from the trust. Today, this morning, right now, I asked why the sudden urgency. Dad said it wasn't my concern why, just that, as trustee, I had a legal obligation to approve legitimate requests. Derek jumped in and said the trust specifically allowed for emergency financial needs, and this qualified. He was using his lawyer voice, trying to intimidate me with legal terminology and obligations. I asked again what the emergency was. Vanessa actually stomped her foot like a toddler and said I was being deliberately difficult, that this was family and family helped each other, and I needed to stop playing games. I looked at her in her designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent and asked her when exactly family started helping each other. When did that begin? Because I must have missed that memo. Mom started crying. Not real crying. That fake crying she does when she wants sympathy. She said I was being cruel, that she didn't understand where this hostility was coming from, that they'd always supported me even when I'd made disappointing choices. And now, when they needed something simple from me, I was acting like this. I asked what disappointing choices she meant. She got flustered. Said that wasn't the point right now. Dad told her to stop and just focus on the issue at hand. He turned to me and said that I needed to understand how serious this was, that there were financial consequences if they didn't get access to these funds by Wednesday. That's when things started getting interesting. I asked what happens Wednesday. Derek said they had an outstanding loan that was being called. If they didn't pay it by Wednesday morning, there would be legal action. Vanessa added that it would ruin them, destroy their credit, make everything public. I sat down in my chair across from them and asked how much they owed. Dad said that wasn't relevant. The trust had the funds, and they were entitled to them. I said actually as trustee I needed to understand what the money was for to approve the release. That's literally in the trust documents that Grandpa wrote. Any withdrawal over a certain amount required documentation of the purpose. Derek tried to argue that emergency provisions overrode that requirement. I told him I'd checked with the law firm managing the trust yesterday afternoon, and they'd confirmed I had full discretion over what constituted an emergency. So either they could explain what was happening, or I couldn't approve anything. Mom looked at Dad. Dad looked at Derek. Derek looked at Vanessa. Nobody wanted to say it. Finally, Mom said they'd taken out a bridge loan 18 months ago against their expected trust distribution. The investment they'd planned fell through, and now the loan was being called with interest and penalties. They owed $473,000 by Wednesday at 9 a.m., or the lender was filing a lawsuit and putting liens on their properties. I just stared at them. $473,000. And they'd never mentioned it. Never told me when I'd signed off on Derek's house money or Vanessa's wedding money. They'd been sitting on this massive debt the whole time while treating me like garbage. I asked why they took out a bridge loan if they had access to the trust. Dad admitted that technically they didn't have full access because of the money they'd borrowed before. That earlier advance I'd found documentation of. They owed that back first before they could get anything else, and they'd been making minimum payments while trying to keep up appearances. The bridge loan was supposed to be temporary until they figured something out. Vanessa said they'd tried everything else, exhausted every option. I was literally their last resort. She said that like it was supposed to make me feel special or something. Your last resort, the family embarrassment, the retail worker, the one who measures feet for minimum wage. Now, suddenly, I'm important. I asked about their houses. Mom said they were mortgaged. I asked about Dad's practice. He said the overhead was massive and everything was tied up in equipment and staff. I asked about Derek's law firm income. He said he had student loans and his own expenses. I asked about Vanessa's husband. She said his income was his business and she wasn't asking him for this kind of money. So basically, they'd all lived beyond their means for years, borrowed against money they didn't actually have yet, and now it was all collapsing and they needed me to fix it. The disappointment, the one they'd erased from Mom's birthday speech, the one they'd told to stay home because I was an embarrassment. I took another sip of my coffee and asked what happens if I say no. The room went dead silent. Mom started crying again, the real kind this time. Dad said I wouldn't do that to my own family. Derek said I'd be liable as trustee if I denied a legitimate request. Vanessa said I was a vindictive little person who'd been waiting for this moment to hurt them. That last part was actually kind of accurate, but I didn't say that. Instead, I asked what they would give me in return. Mom looked confused. In return for what? For signing? For saving them? For bailing out people who'd spent 3 years treating me like I didn't exist? What was that worth to them? Dad said I had a legal obligation and there was no in return. I was required to approve the withdrawal. I pulled out my phone and read from the email the trust lawyer had sent me Sunday afternoon. The one that specifically said I had full discretion to approve or deny any request based on my judgment of whether it served the best interest of all beneficiaries and the trust's long-term stability. Taking out $500,000 to pay off a bad loan they'd never disclosed wasn't exactly in the trust's best interests. Derek lunged forward like he was going to grab my phone. Dad put a hand on his shoulder. Mom was full-on sobbing now. Vanessa was calling me names. Every horrible thing. Saying I was doing this because I was jealous of their success. Because I'd failed at life and wanted to drag them down. Because I was bitter and small and pathetic. I let her finish. Then I asked if she remembered the phone call 2 weeks ago, when she told me not to come to Mom's party, when she said I was an embarrassment, when she laughed about me measuring feet for minimum wage. I asked if she remembered any of that. She said that was different. That was about Mom's party and her reputation. This was about their lives being destroyed. I said it seemed like their lives and their reputation and their social status were always more important than anything else, always more important than me. So why should I care about protecting those things now? Dad tried a different approach, sat down next to Mom and got quiet, said he knew they hadn't treated me well, that there had been distance in the family, that maybe they'd put too much emphasis on careers and achievements. But this was serious. This would ruin all of them, destroy everything they'd built. And did I really want that on my conscience? I asked him what he texted me last week. He looked confused. I pulled up the message and read it out loud. The one where he told me to do them a favor and stay home because nobody wanted to explain why their son was a retail slave. I asked him if he'd really sent that. He started to say something about being frustrated and not meaning it exactly that way. I read it again. Word for word. Retail slave. Nobody wants to explain. Do us a favor and stay home. The apartment got very quiet. Mom wiped her eyes. Derek was staring at his phone. Vanessa had stopped pacing and was just standing there looking at me like she was seeing me for the first time. I told them I needed time to think about it, that I wasn't making any decisions at 5 a.m. without proper consideration. Mom started to protest, but Dad stopped her. He asked how much time. I said I'd need to review all the trust documents, talk to the lawyers, understand all the implications, maybe by end of business Tuesday. Derek exploded. He said Tuesday was too late. Wednesday morning was the deadline. If I waited until Tuesday night, they wouldn't have time to process everything. I said that sounded like poor planning on their part. Maybe they should have talked to me sooner. Maybe they should have mentioned this bridge loan situation when I was signing off on his house purchase or Vanessa's wedding expenses. Maybe they should have treated me like family instead of an embarrassment. Vanessa called me a manipulative asshole, said I was holding this over their heads on purpose, said I'd always been jealous of them, and now I finally had power and was abusing it. I asked her when exactly she'd decided I was jealous. Was it when she removed me from the family group text? Was it when she told me not to come to Mom's party? Or was it when she posted on Instagram about being grateful the family disappointment wasn't coming? She went pale, asked how I knew about that. I told her my coworker Kyle follows her and showed me. She stammered something about it being a joke and not actually about me. I asked who else it could possibly have been about. She didn't answer. Mom tried to take control again. Said everyone needed to calm down. That we were family and we'd work this out. That I was hurt and angry and had every right to be. But this situation was bigger than past conflicts. People made mistakes, said hurtful things. But when it came down to it, family had to stick together. I was their son, their brother, and they needed me. I asked where that family loyalty was at her birthday party, when she gave a speech about being blessed with her children and only mentioned 2 of them, when she told 100 people about Derek and Vanessa, but I didn't even get a sentence, not even an acknowledgement that I existed. Where was family loyalty then? She cried harder. Said she didn't know what to say, that she'd been wrong, that she'd let her pride and her friends' opinions matter too much, that she was sorry, but here's the thing about apologies at 5 a.m. when someone needs $500,000 from you. They don't really count. They're just words said out of desperation, not actual remorse, not actual change, just whatever it takes to get what they need. I stood up and told them I'd give them my answer by Tuesday afternoon. Not negotiable. They could wait like I'd waited for 3 years to matter to them. Derek started arguing again, but Dad pulled him toward the door. Mom asked if we could all have breakfast and talk more. I said I had to get ready for work. She looked surprised. Asked if I was really going to work at a time like this. I reminded her that unlike them, I actually enjoyed my job. They filed out. Vanessa was the last one at the door and she turned back. Said I better think really hard about what I was doing. That if I let this loan go into default and destroy them, I'd regret it. That there would be consequences. I asked what kind of consequences. She said I'd find out. Then she left. I closed the door and locked it. Stood there processing everything. They'd come here desperate. Revealed their financial disaster. Offered fake apologies. Threatened me. And left with nothing settled. But what they didn't know was that while they'd been at my apartment, I'd gotten 3 emails on my phone. The first was from the trust lawyers confirming our Sunday consultation appointment on Wednesday morning. The second was from Derek's law firm's HR department with a notification I'd requested regarding their benefits information. And the third was from the lending company Mom and Dad used for their bridge loan, responding to an inquiry I'd sent Saturday night about the loan terms and conditions. Because here's what I'd learned working retail management for 7 years. Information is inventory. And I'd been stockpiling inventory on my family for 3 years, waiting for exactly this moment. Tuesday morning, I called in sick to work. First time in 18 months. My manager was concerned, asked if I was okay. I told her I had a family emergency. She told me to take care of it and not worry about the store. Then I spent Tuesday making phone calls. A lot of phone calls. To the trust lawyers. To Grandpa's old financial advisor who'd helped set up the trust. To a friend who worked in banking. To another friend who knew about real estate. By Tuesday afternoon, I had a very clear picture of exactly how bad things were for my family. And exactly how much power I had. I sent a group text to all 4 of them at 4 p.m., told them to meet me at the Riverside Diner at 6. Public place, neutral ground, where we could talk without screaming. Derek responded immediately asking why I was playing games. Dad said we could just come back to my apartment. Mom asked if this meant I'd made a decision. Vanessa didn't respond. I said the diner at 6 or nothing. Take it or leave it. They all showed up. Of course they did. They didn't have a choice. And what I told them at that diner changed everything. Not just for them. For me too. But that conversation also opened up something else I hadn't anticipated. Because while we were sitting in that booth, Vanessa's phone rang, her husband, and the conversation I overheard from her end made me realize this situation was even messier than I thought. Turns out I wasn't the only one in the family keeping secrets. Update 2. The comments on my last post were wild. Half of you said I should absolutely destroy them. The other half said, be careful because family is complicated. One person said I should charge them interest on top of everything, which honestly hadn't even occurred to me, but I kinda love it. Anyway, here's what happened at the diner, and things got so much more complicated than even I expected. So Tuesday at 6 p.m., I was already sitting in a booth at Riverside Diner. When they showed up, I'd gotten there early on purpose because I wanted to watch them walk in, wanted to see them looking for me, wanted them to come to me for once instead of just expecting me to show up wherever they demanded. Mom and Dad arrived first. They looked exhausted. Mom's hair wasn't done the way she usually keeps it, and Dad was in casual clothes, which never happens. He's always in business attire, always projecting that successful surgeon image. Seeing him in jeans and a regular button-down was weird. They slid into the booth across from me, and Mom immediately started talking about how we needed to work together as a family. Dad cut her off and said they should wait for Derek and Vanessa. Derek showed up 5 minutes later looking furious. He threw himself into the booth next to Mom and immediately asked what game I was playing. Why couldn't we just do this at my apartment or their house? Why make them come to some random diner? I told him this wasn't their territory, and it wasn't mine. Neutral ground. He called it theatrical and stupid. Vanessa was late, 15 minutes late. When she finally walked in, she looked stressed and kept checking her phone. She sat down next to Derek and said she couldn't stay long. She had somewhere else to be. Dad said this was more important than wherever else. She snapped at him that he didn't know what was important in her life. Interesting start. Already tension between them, before I'd even said anything. I ordered coffee. The waitress came and I ordered for myself and didn't ask if anyone else wanted anything. Just coffee for me, thanks. Mom looked like she wanted to say something about manners, but stopped herself. They all just sat there waiting for me to start talking. I took my time, stirred sugar into my coffee, took a sip. Finally, I told them I'd spent all day Tuesday doing research, looking into the trust, looking into their finances, talking to lawyers and financial advisors, understanding exactly what situation they were in and what my options were as trustee. Derek interrupted to say he'd looked into it too, and I absolutely had to approve the withdrawal. The trust provisions were clear. Dad agreed. Said Grandpa wouldn't have wanted me to let them suffer when the trust had the funds available. Mom said Grandpa loved all of us and would want us to help each other. I asked if Grandpa would want me to help people who'd spent 3 years pretending I didn't exist, who'd erased me from family events, who'd called me an embarrassment and a retail slave. Mom started crying again. Derek said I needed to get over past hurts and focus on the present crisis. Vanessa checked her phone again. I told them I'd spoken to the trust lawyer that morning for 2 hours. Went through every provision, every clause, every contingency Grandpa had written. And I'd learned some interesting things. First, I had complete discretion over approvals. Second, I could set conditions on any withdrawal to protect the long-term stability of the trust. Third, any money I approved would permanently reduce their individual shares by that amount plus 20% penalty for emergency withdrawals. Dad's face went white. He asked what I meant by penalty. I explained that Grandpa had structured it so emergency withdrawals came with consequences. If I approved the $473,000 to pay their loan, their individual shares would be reduced by $567,000 total. Basically, they'd be paying back more than they borrowed from their own future inheritance. Derek said that was insane, and there was no way that was in the trust documents. I pulled out my phone and showed him the email from the lawyer with the exact provision highlighted. He grabbed my phone and read it. His expression changed. He handed the phone back and didn't say anything. Mom asked if there was any way around the penalty. I said yes. If the money was for specifically approved purposes like medical emergencies, education, or first home purchase, no penalty. But paying off a bad investment loan they'd never disclosed definitely counted as emergency withdrawal. Full penalty applies. Vanessa's phone rang. She looked at it, and her whole face changed. She answered even though we were in the middle of this conversation. She walked away from the table toward the diner entrance. I could hear her end of the conversation from where I sat, her husband asking where she was, her saying she was dealing with a family thing, him saying they needed to talk tonight about something important, her voice getting higher pitched saying she'd be home soon, him saying this couldn't wait, her almost yelling that she'd be there as soon as she could and hanging up. She came back to the table looking shaken. Mom asked if everything was okay. Vanessa said it was fine and to continue, but she was gripping her phone so hard her knuckles were white. I continued. I said that even with the penalty, I could technically approve the withdrawal. The trust had the funds. They'd lose a big chunk of their inheritance, but they'd avoid the lawsuit and the liens on their properties. However, I had conditions. Derek laughed. Actually laughed. Said of course I had conditions. Said I'd been waiting years for this moment to hold something over them. I asked him if he wanted to hear the conditions or if he'd rather just let the loan default tomorrow morning. He shut up. My first condition was that they put in writing exactly why they'd excluded me from their lives. A detailed explanation from each of them about what I'd done to deserve being erased. Mom protested that we didn't need to dredge up the past. I said that was my condition. Take it or leave it. Dad asked what I'd do with these written explanations. I said maybe nothing. Maybe I'd just keep them. Maybe I'd want to remember exactly what they thought of me when they needed me to save them. Vanessa said I was being cruel. I asked if she remembered telling me not to come to Mom's birthday party because I was an embarrassment. She said she'd apologized for that. I said she'd apologized because she needed money, not because she was actually sorry. There's a difference. Second condition. I wanted to be named co-trustee with veto power over any future withdrawals. Not just for their shares, but for mine too. Complete transparency on all trust activities. Derek immediately said no way, said I'd abuse that power. I pointed out that I was already the sole trustee and hadn't abused anything. This would actually give them more oversight since they'd see everything I did too. He argued, but Dad stopped him. Said they'd agree to that. Third condition. They had to tell everyone at their social gatherings, country club, all of Mom's friends, everyone they'd been lying to, the truth about what I do for a living. No more traveling for business. No more vague explanations. They had to actually acknowledge that I exist and work in retail. Mom looked devastated. She asked if I understood what I was asking, if I knew how humiliating that would be for her. I asked if it would be as humiliating as being excluded from her birthday party. She didn't answer. Fourth condition. Weekly family dinners, all of us. At my apartment, my space, my rules. Not their fancy houses in Westfield Heights. My modest apartment that Mom had judged when she'd barged in at 5 a.m. every Sunday for the next year. Miss one dinner without a legitimate emergency, and the deal was off. Vanessa said that was ridiculous. She had her own life and her own family now. She couldn't commit to weekly dinners. I shrugged and said then maybe they should explore other options for the loan. She asked what other options. I said that was their problem to figure out. She looked at Derek. Derek looked at Dad. Dad looked at Mom. Mom asked if those were all my conditions. I said there was one more. I wanted a formal apology from each of them, not just words. A written letter explaining exactly what they'd done wrong, why it was wrong, and what they'd do differently going forward. And these letters would be part of the trust documentation, permanently filed with the lawyers, available for review if there were ever future disputes. Derek said I was making this into a power trip, that I was enjoying holding this over them. I told him he was absolutely right. I'd spent 3 years being treated like garbage, and now, yes, I was enjoying watching them squirm. I'd earned this moment. Every time they'd excluded me, every time they'd made me feel worthless, every time they'd prioritized their image over their actual son and brother, they'd been building toward this. So yes, I was enjoying it. The table went quiet. The waitress came by to refill my coffee and asked if anyone else wanted to order. Nobody responded. She left. Dad finally spoke. He said my conditions were harsh, but they'd accept them. All of them. They'd write the explanations and the apologies. They'd come to weekly dinners. They'd be honest about my job. They'd make me co-trustee. Whatever I wanted. Just please approve the withdrawal so they could pay the loan tomorrow. I told him I'd think about it. He looked confused. Think about it? I'd just laid out my conditions and he'd agreed. What was there to think about? I said I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything, that I wanted one more night to review everything with the lawyers. I'd give them my final answer Wednesday morning at 8 a.m., 1 hour before their loan was due. Derek slammed his hand on the table. People in the diner turned to look. He said I was playing games, that this was manipulation, that I was torturing them on purpose. I said, yep, that's exactly what I was doing. And he'd sit there and take it because he had no other options. His face turned red, but he didn't say anything else. Mom tried one more approach. She got softer. Said she understood I was angry, that I had every right to be, that she'd failed me as a mother. She'd prioritized the wrong things. Let social pressure and pride corrupt what should have mattered most, which was her children. All 3 of her children. She was ashamed of how she'd acted, and she'd spend the rest of her life making it up to me if I'd just please give them this chance. It was a good speech, almost convincing. But I'd heard her give speeches before, at charity events, at country club gatherings. She was good at saying what people wanted to hear. I told her I'd give her my answer in the morning. Vanessa's phone rang again. Same ringtone. She looked at it and panic crossed her face. She rejected the call. Immediately, it rang again. She stood up and answered it while walking toward the door again. This time, her end of the conversation was different. She was saying she told him she'd be home soon, that this was important family business. Then her voice got really quiet, but I could still hear parts of it. Something about needing to explain something. Something about not knowing how to tell him. Something about making a mistake. She came back and said she had to leave right now. Mom asked if her husband was okay. Vanessa said he was fine. They just had things to discuss. She looked at me and said she'd better see that approval in the morning or she'd personally make my life miserable. I told her she'd already done that for 3 years, so I was pretty used to it by now. She left. After Vanessa was gone, the dynamic shifted. Derek asked what her deal was. Mom said she'd seemed upset lately but wouldn't talk about it. Dad said maybe marriage to a surgeon wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Derek laughed and said, maybe Dr. Perfect wasn't so perfect after all. That's when I realized something. They didn't actually know what was going on with Vanessa, just like they hadn't known about each other's financial problems until everything collapsed. This family that was so obsessed with image and success and status, nobody actually talked to each other honestly about anything real. I asked how much they actually knew about each other's lives. Real lives, not the polished versions they presented. Derek said enough. I asked when was the last time any of them had a real conversation. Mom said they talked all the time. I asked when was the last time they talked about something that wasn't achievements or social events or keeping up appearances. Nobody answered. Dad said that wasn't relevant to the current situation. I said maybe it was exactly relevant. Maybe the reason they were all in this mess was because they'd spent so long pretending everything was perfect that they'd stopped being real with each other, stopped being actual family, become just people who shared DNA and attended the same social events and kept up the same facade. Derek said I didn't understand their world. The pressure to maintain certain standards, the expectations. I said I understood perfectly. I'd grown up in that world. I'd just chosen to leave it because I'd realized it was hollow and exhausting and fake. And look where their world had gotten them. Nearly $500,000 in debt. Lying to each other, desperate enough to beg the family embarrassment for help at 5 a.m. Mom asked if I was saying they deserved this. I said I wasn't saying they deserved anything. I was saying they'd built this situation themselves, made choices that led here. And now they had to live with the consequences, just like they'd always told me I had to live with the consequences of my choices to work retail and drop out of the business program. The diner was emptying out. It was almost 8 p.m. We'd been sitting there for 2 hours. Dad said we should probably go. He asked one more time if I'd approve the withdrawal. I said I'd let them know at 8 a.m. He nodded. They all stood up to leave. As they were walking out, Mom turned back. She asked if I really hated them. I told her I didn't hate them. Hate required caring enough to feel that strongly. What I felt was more like disappointment. In them. In what our family had become. In the fact that it took a financial crisis for them to even acknowledge I existed. She looked like I'd slapped her. Then she left with Dad and Derek. I sat in that booth for another hour after they'd gone. Ordered pie, ate it slowly. The waitress asked if I was okay. I told her I'd just had the most important family meeting of my life. She said family was complicated. I said that was an understatement. When I finally got home around 9:30, I had 14 messages. 3 from Derek asking for confirmation I'd approve the withdrawal. 5 from Mom saying various versions of please and explaining how this would destroy them. 2 from Dad with legal language about trustee obligations. 2 from Vanessa that just said call me. And 2 from a number I didn't recognize. I called the unknown number back. It was Vanessa's husband, Dr. Richard Chen. We'd met maybe 3 times at family events before I'd stopped attending. He asked if I'd seen Vanessa that evening. I said yes, at a family dinner. He asked if she'd seemed upset or distracted. I said she'd gotten several calls from him and left early. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if our family was having financial problems. Specifically, if Vanessa had mentioned anything about money or loans or needing funds. I asked why he was asking me. He said Vanessa had been acting strange for weeks. Secretive, defensive, taking calls in other rooms. He'd checked their joint bank account that evening and found a withdrawal of $50,000 that she couldn't explain when he'd asked about it earlier. She'd said it was for a family thing but wouldn't elaborate. He was worried. I sat there processing this. Vanessa had taken $50,000 from their joint account, probably trying to contribute to the loan payment, but she hadn't told her husband why. And now he was suspicious and asking questions, and she was caught between her original family's disaster and her marriage. I told Richard I couldn't discuss family finances with him, that he needed to talk to Vanessa about whatever was going on. He said he'd tried, but she kept shutting down. He asked if I thought she was in trouble. I said honestly, I thought all of them were in trouble, but they'd made their own choices. He thanked me and hung up. So now, there was another layer. Vanessa's marriage was imploding because she'd tried to secretly help with the family loan. Richard was suspicious and asking questions. And she was trapped because if she told him the truth, he'd know her entire family was a financial disaster hiding behind designer clothes and country club memberships. I went to bed that night knowing I held all the cards. Wednesday morning at 8 a.m., I'd either save them or let it all collapse. Either way, they'd never forget who had the power when it mattered. My alarm went off at 6 a.m. Wednesday. I had 2 hours to decide what kind of person I wanted to be. The vengeful one who'd let them drown. Or the one who'd help but make sure they never treated anyone like garbage again. I grabbed my phone to check messages and saw I had 23 new ones. Most from my family in increasingly desperate tones. But one was from Richard again, sent at 2 a.m. It said Vanessa had finally told him everything. About the loan, the trust, their parents' financial problems, everything. And he had some questions for me about family dynamics and trustee responsibilities. He wanted to meet before I made my decision, said it was urgent. This situation had just gotten even more complicated, and I still had 90 minutes to decide whether to destroy my family or save them with conditions that would humiliate them for years. The revenge I'd planned for 3 years was right there. All I had to do was say no. But something about Richard's message made me pause. Made me wonder if there was something else going on that I didn't know about yet. I guess I'd find out in 90 minutes. Final update. Okay, so this is probably going to be my last update because, honestly, everything that could happen has happened and I'm still processing all of it. To everyone who said I should make them suffer, you're going to love this. To everyone who said be careful with revenge, you were absolutely right, but I did it anyway. Wednesday morning at 6:30 a.m., I met Richard at a coffee place near my apartment. He looked like he hadn't slept. He ordered black coffee and got straight to it. Said Vanessa had finally broken down around 3 a.m. and told him everything about the family finances, the bridge loan, the trust, how they'd all been living beyond their means for years, how they'd excluded me and now desperately needed me to save them. He asked me point blank what I was going to do. I told him I hadn't decided yet. He said that wasn't true. Said he could tell from how I'd structured my conditions that I'd been planning this for a long time, that this was calculated. I asked him what made him think that. He said he'd seen the trust documents, knew I'd been trustee for 3 years, knew I'd approved Derek and Vanessa's previous withdrawals without conditions. So obviously something had changed. Obviously, I'd been waiting for the right moment. I told him he was perceptive. He said he was worried about Vanessa. Not just the money, but her mental state. She'd been falling apart for weeks carrying this secret about her family's financial disaster while trying to maintain the perfect image. He asked if I cared about that at all. I asked him if he knew what they'd said to me, what they'd called me, how they'd erased me. He said Vanessa had told him some of it. He said it was horrible, and he understood why I was angry. But destroying them financially wouldn't actually make me feel better. That revenge rarely does. I told him I wasn't looking to feel better. I was looking for accountability. For 3 years, I'd been nothing to them. Now, suddenly, I mattered because they needed something. That wasn't family. That was transactional. He asked what I meant. I told him about my conditions. All of them. The written explanations. The co-trustee arrangement. The weekly dinners. The public acknowledgement of my actual job. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said those conditions would humiliate them, especially Mom with her social circle. I said good. They'd humiliated me for years. Turnabout was fair. He said 2 wrongs didn't make a right. I said maybe not, but they made things even. Richard checked his watch. 7:15. 45 minutes until the deadline. He asked if I was really going to make them wait until the last minute. I said absolutely. I'd waited 3 years for this moment. They could wait 45 minutes. He paid for both our coffees and left. I sat there until 7:45. Then I drove to my parents' house in Westfield Heights. They were all already there, all 4 of them plus Richard, standing in the driveway like they'd been watching for me. Mom looked like she'd aged 10 years overnight. Dad's hands were shaking. Derek was pacing. Vanessa was crying. I got out of my car and they all started talking at once. I held up my hand and they went quiet. I told them to go inside. We'd discussed this properly. In their living room, I told them I'd approve the withdrawal. Mom started crying with relief. Dad thanked me. Derek looked suspicious. I said, but all my conditions stood, non-negotiable, plus one additional condition I'd thought of overnight. Derek asked what? I said I wanted access to all their financial records going forward. Complete transparency, their mortgages, their debt, their income, their spending, everything. As trustee, I needed to see it all. Dad said that was invasive. I said it was standard practice. If they didn't want to comply, they could find another way to pay their loan. Derek said they'd agree. Richard said he'd already agreed to full transparency with me anyway. I called the trust lawyers on speaker, told them I was approving the emergency withdrawal of $473,000, confirmed all the conditions including the 20% penalty. The lawyer said she'd prepare paperwork immediately, asked if all parties understood the terms. Everyone said yes. I told them we'd meet at the law office at 8:30 to sign. That gave them 30 minutes before the loan payment was due. Mom asked about the written explanations and apologies. I said they had 1 week to submit them. Dad asked if we could skip that part. I said absolutely not. Those letters would be filed with the trust documentation permanently. We all drove to the law office separately. The lawyer had everything ready. She went through each provision methodically. The withdrawal amount, the penalty, the co-trustee arrangement, the transparency requirements. Asked if everyone understood they were permanently reducing their inheritance by $567,000 to access $473,000 now. They all confirmed. Derek tried one last play. Asked the lawyer if my conditions were legally enforceable. She said absolutely. The trust gave me broad discretion. Everything I'd required was within my authority. He asked if there was any way to challenge it. She said only if he could prove I was acting in bad faith. Given that I was protecting the trust's long-term stability and ensuring accountability, good luck proving bad faith. Everyone signed. By 8:50 a.m., the money had been transferred, 5 minutes before default. Dad looked like he might pass out from relief. Mom was still crying. Derek looked like he wanted to punch something. We stood in the parking lot afterward. Dad asked if we were good now, if this was over. I told him this was just beginning. They'd agreed to a year of weekly dinners, to public honesty about my job, to complete financial transparency. This wasn't over. This was a complete restructuring of our family dynamic. Vanessa asked when the first dinner was. I said Sunday at 6 p.m. My apartment. Don't be late. Derek muttered something about this being ridiculous. I asked him to repeat that. He said nothing. Richard pulled me aside, thanked me for approving the withdrawal, said he knew it would have been easier to just let them fail. I told him I didn't do it for them. I did it because it gave me more power than letting them collapse would have. If I'd said no, they'd have been ruined, but I'd have been done with them. This way I controlled them. They needed me. They had to comply with my conditions or violate a legal agreement. This was better revenge than destruction. He said that was cold. I said 3 years of being erased was cold. This was justice. He said he hoped I knew what I was doing. I told him I'd been planning this since Grandpa died and made me trustee. Every decision since then had been positioning myself for this exact scenario. Staying in retail, maintaining distance, learning everything about the trust in their finances, waiting for them to need me desperately enough that I could dictate terms. This wasn't impulsive. This was strategic. He looked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, said I was more calculating than he'd realized. I said most people underestimated me. That was their mistake. Over the next week, I received all 4 written explanations. Mom's was 8 pages going through her thought process over the years. How she'd started with small lies about my job, how those lies had grown, how she'd convinced herself she was protecting the family reputation, how she'd failed me as a mother. Dad's was shorter but honest, talking about how he'd valued professional success above everything, how he'd seen my retail choice as a personal failure. Derek's was 12 pages struggling with growing up as the golden child, how excluding me had boosted his own ego. Vanessa's talked about marrying Richard to cement her status, how she'd been cruel because she'd been insecure. Sunday at 6 p.m., they all showed up at my apartment. I'd ordered pizza, basic pepperoni, and cheese. We sat in my small living room with paper plates and cheap soda, and nobody knew how to act. I asked how their week had been. Mom said she'd had lunch with her book club and had told them the truth about my job for the first time, that I was assistant manager at Foot Locker, and she was proud of me. Karen had asked why she'd lied before. Mom said she'd been ashamed and wrong. Dad said he'd had similar conversations with his golf partners. Derek said he hadn't told anyone yet because he didn't know how to frame it. I said that was the problem. Just tell the truth. No framing needed. Vanessa said she and Richard had been in couples counseling since Wednesday, that taking money without explanation had broken his trust. They were working through it, but it was hard. We ate pizza. It was awkward. Finally, I asked about their finances. Dad pulled out a folder, showed me their situation. It was worse than I'd thought. Even with the loan paid off, they were barely breaking even monthly. The country club alone was $4,000 a month. The cars were leased at premium rates. They were living on credit and reputation. I asked why they didn't downsize. Mom said they couldn't. Dad said their whole life was built around that image. I said no, that's who they were pretending to be. Who they actually were was people drowning in debt while pretending to be wealthy. The conversation got heated. Derek said I didn't understand their world. I said I understood perfectly. I'd left because I'd seen how hollow it was. I'd chosen authenticity and they'd punished me for it. And now their image was bankrupting them, while my modest, authentic life was stable. Vanessa started crying, said she didn't know how to be anything else, that she'd spent her whole life trying to be perfect and now she didn't know who she was underneath. Richard said that was what they were working on in counseling. That was 3 weeks ago. We've had 3 more Sunday dinners since then, each one slightly less awkward. They're all still adjusting to being real with me. Mom has started being honest with her social circle and losing some friends, but says the ones who stuck around are actually real friends. Dad is understanding his worth isn't tied to his children's careers. Derek is struggling the most. Vanessa and Richard are making progress. The trust situation is stable. They're all receiving monthly financial counseling that I mandated, working on budgets, looking at downsizing, actually dealing with reality. And me? I got promoted to store manager last week. Different location, bigger store, significant pay increase. First thing I did was text the family group chat. Mom said she was proud. Dad said congratulations. Derek said that was great. Vanessa said I'd earned it. It felt good. Not because they approved, but because I'd forced them to acknowledge reality. I'd taken their desperation and used it to completely restructure our family dynamic. They don't get to erase me anymore. They don't get to pretend I don't exist. They don't get to make me feel worthless. I'm done being the family embarrassment. Now I'm the one they answer to. The one who controls their access to money they desperately need. The one who demands honesty and accountability. Some people said revenge wouldn't make me feel better. They were wrong. This feels amazing. Not the petty satisfaction kind, the deep structural justice kind. I didn't just get even. I completely changed the power dynamic. Retail slave to family trustee. Embarrassment to authority figure. Erased son to the one everyone has to answer to. Grandpa Jim knew exactly what he was doing when he made me trustee. He knew they'd eventually need me. He knew I'd handle it when the time came. And to anyone else out there who's been made to feel worthless by their family, sometimes the best revenge is being exactly who you are and making them deal with it on your terms. They tried to erase me. Instead, I made myself impossible to ignore.